The sound cracked through the classroom before anyone understood what had happened. I was sitting 3 rows back, close enough to see everything, too far to stop any of it. One moment Dravith was standing over the new girl's desk, his long arm pulled back. The next moment, his hand had already struck her cheek, and the whole room had gone silent. In that strange way, silence happens only after something has gone very wrong. Her name was Nora Ashby. She had been with us for 11 days. I want to tell this story from the beginning, because if I only tell you what happened in that one moment, you will not understand why it changed everything. You will not understand why, 10 seconds later, Dravith stood in the middle of the room and did not know who he was anymore. Let me start with the day she arrived. Our classroom sits on the upper ring of the CoulSci Learning Spire, a place built for students from 19 different worlds. We are used to strange faces. A student with 4 eyes does not turn heads here. A student who breathes through gill slits along his neck barely gets a second glance. But when the door opened that morning and a single human girl stepped through, escorted by a tired-looking administrator, every single one of us stopped what we were doing. Earth had only been part of the wider community for a short while. Everyone had heard of it. Everyone had opinions about it, most of them unkind, though not cruel in the way you might expect. It was pity, mostly. Earth was labeled, in every guidebook and every casual conversation, as a death world. A place with crushing gravity swings, savage weather, unstable ecosystems, and short, fragile lives. Humans, we had all been taught, were the sympathetic underdogs of the galaxy, soft-bodied, short-lived, prone to disease, prone to injury, prone to dying from things the rest of us would barely notice, like a change in air pressure or a bad fall down a flight of stairs. So when Nora walked in, thin and quiet, with pale skin and dark hair pulled back simply, no one was afraid of her. If anything, the room felt a strange kind of tenderness toward her, the way you might feel toward a small animal that wandered somewhere it did not belong. She did not introduce herself with any flourish. She said her name, gave a short nod, and took the only open seat, which happened to be at the back corner of the room, away from the rest of us. She did not seem nervous. She did not seem excited either. She simply sat down, opened her data slate, and began to work. I remember thinking, at the time, that she seemed unusually still. Not frightened still, the way you might expect from someone surrounded by creatures 3 times her size. Just still, like water in a covered container, waiting. Over the following days, small things became noticeable if you paid attention, though most of my classmates did not. When Instructor Vel, our combat theory teacher, demonstrated a controlled strike on a training dummy hard enough to crack its outer shell, half the room gasped. Nora did not blink. When a visiting diplomat's guard, a broad-shouldered Threll soldier nearly twice her height, walked past our group in the hallway with his usual heavy, deliberate footsteps meant to make everyone step aside, Nora did not step aside. She simply adjusted her path a few inches, calmly, the way you might avoid a puddle, and kept walking. When another student, in a moment of curiosity rather than malice, asked her how humans survived on such a violent planet, she answered plainly. "We didn't always survive," she said. "A lot of things did not make it. We did." She said it without any drama in her voice. She said it the way someone might mention the weather. I noticed these things, but I did not think much of them. None of us did. We had been told, over and over, in every lesson about Earth's classification, that humans were the Deathworld's victims, not its survivors. We assumed her calmness was simply a kind of nervous emptiness, a shy student trying to get through her days without drawing attention. Dravith thought something else entirely. Dravith was the largest student in our year, a Karasi male with thick gray plating along his forearms and a voice that filled a room whether he wanted it to or not. He was not unintelligent, but he was used to being the strongest person in almost every space he entered, and he had built his entire sense of himself around that fact. When new students arrived, he tested them, the way some creatures test the strength of a new branch before putting their full weight on it. He had done it to nearly every new student before Nora. a shove in the hallway, a comment about someone's homeworld meant to draw a reaction, a show of strength meant to establish, quickly and without room for debate, exactly where everyone stood in relation to him. Most students backed down immediately. Some tried to laugh it off. A few reported him to the faculty, which only made him angrier and more careful about when he chose to act. When Nora arrived, and the whispers about Earth being a death world reached him, I think he saw an opportunity rather than a person. Here was a student from a planet everyone described as fragile, fatal, pitiable. Here was a student who did not flinch, did not shrink, did not perform the nervousness he expected. To Draveth, her calm was not a sign of strength. It was a challenge to his authority, an insult wrapped in silence. I did not know, that morning, that he had decided today would be the day he corrected that insult. I only found out when class began, and I saw him walking toward her desk, with a stride I recognized, the stride he used right before he made an example of someone. The room had already settled into its usual quiet hum of activity. Instructor Vell had stepped out briefly to retrieve materials from the adjoining supply room, which left us, as it so often did, without any adult supervision for a few unstructured minutes. Draveth had learned to use those minutes well. He stopped in front of Nora's desk. She did not look up immediately, which seemed to annoy him further. "Deathworld girl," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room, pulling every eye toward them. "Tell the class, how many of your kind die before they reach adulthood? I heard it is nearly half." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Someone near me let out a nervous laugh, the kind people make when they are relieved a comment was not directed at them. Nora looked up at him then, calm and unreadable, the same expression she wore every single day since she arrived. "Depends on the century," she said simply. It was not defiance in her tone. It was not fear either. It was something closer to fact, delivered without any need for an audience. Draveth's plated jaw tightened. I think, more than the words, it was her stillness that provoked him. He was used to reactions, fear, anger, tears, pleading. Her calm gave him nothing to grip onto, and creatures like Draveth do not handle having nothing to grip onto very well. "Prey animals," he said, louder now, clearly performing for the room rather than speaking only to her. "That is what your whole species is, soft, slow, built to be eaten by anything with real teeth. It is almost sad how weak you all are." Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper for him to stop, though not loud enough for him to hear it. No one moved to intervene. That was not unusual. Interfering with Draveth had a cost, and most of us had learned to avoid paying it. Nora set down her stylus with slow, deliberate care, the way someone puts down a tool they do not want to accidentally damage. She looked at him, and for the first time since she arrived, something shifted behind her eyes. It was not fear. If I had to describe it, I would say it looked like patience, finally reaching its limit, though even then, her voice stayed level. "You should stop talking about things you don't understand," she said quietly. The room went very still. Even Draveth seemed briefly thrown by the calm firmness in her tone, a tone that did not match anything he had been told to expect from a Deathworld student. But being thrown off only made him angrier. "Or what?" he said, leaning down toward her, his shadow falling fully across her desk. "What exactly will a soft little Deathworld girl do about it?" I remember the exact feeling in the room in that moment, because I have thought about it many times since. It was the feeling of an entire class holding its breath without deciding to. The collective sense that something was about to happen that none of us could stop and none of us fully understood. Nora did not answer him with words. Draveth's hand moved fast, faster than I expected from someone his size, closing the distance in a single motion meant to humiliate rather than truly harm, the kind of strike meant to remind someone smaller exactly where they stood. The sound of it cracked through the room. Her head turned slightly with the force of it. For one terrible second, the entire class seemed to freeze in place, waiting for her to cry out, to cower, to do any of the things every student before her had done when Draveth decided to make his point. She did not cry out. Her head turned back toward him, slow and steady, and in her eyes there was no shock at all. There was only a terrible, focused stillness, like something ancient waking up after a very long sleep. And that is when everything changed, faster than any of us could have imagined, faster than any of us were ready to witness. I have replayed what happened next in my mind more times than I can count, and even now, knowing every detail, it is still difficult to describe in a way that makes sense to someone who was not there. It did not look like a fight. That is the first thing I need you to understand. A fight has a rhythm to it, a back and forth, a moment where both sides are still deciding what will happen. What happened between Nora and Dravith had no rhythm at all. It had a beginning, and then it was already over, and the space between those 2 points felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Dravith's hand was still close to her face when her own hand moved. I did not see her decide to move it. There was no visible moment of thought, no hesitation, no gathering of will the way you see in students preparing for a sparring exercise. Her hand simply was not there, and then it was, wrapped around his wrist with a grip that stopped his arm completely, mid-motion, as though his whole limb had struck an invisible wall. Dravith's eyes went wide. I do not think he understood, in that first instant, what was happening. I do not think any of us did. She did not simply hold his wrist. She turned it, a small motion, barely more than a twist of her own hand, but it was enough to fold his arm at an angle it was never meant to bend toward, and enough to pull him forward and down in the same breath. His plated forearm, the same forearm he used to intimidate half the school, gave him no advantage at all in that moment. It simply followed the direction her hand told it to go. He stumbled forward, off balance, his much greater size and weight working against him instead of for him, because for the first time in his life, that size and weight were being used against him by someone else's precision instead of his own force. I want to be clear that what I saw was not cruelty. It did not look like anger either. It looked practiced, in a way that felt far older than anything any of us had trained for in Instructor Vell's classes. It looked like something that had been built into her long before she ever stepped into this school, long before she ever met Dravith, long before Earth ever sent a single student out into the wider community of worlds. Her second movement came before his first stumble had even finished. Her free hand met his shoulder, not with a strike, but with a guiding pressure, redirecting the momentum he had already given her, rather than adding force of her own. It was almost gentle, in its way, though gentle is a strange word to use for something that dropped a creature nearly twice her size toward the floor as easily as closing a door. His knee buckled. His plated shoulder came down hard against the edge of a nearby desk, knocking it sideways with a loud scrape that finally broke the class's collective silence into a scattering of gasps and startled movement. Chairs shifted. Someone near the front stood up without meaning to. A data slate clattered off a desk and hit the floor. And then, just as quickly as it began, it was over. Dravith was on the ground, one arm still held at an angle by Nora's grip, his knee against the floor, his breath coming out in short, stunned bursts. He was not seriously hurt. I want to be very clear about that, because in the moment, before any of us understood what we were looking at, there was a flicker of fear that something terrible had happened. But he was not seriously hurt. He was simply, completely, without any possible argument, no longer in control of his own body. Nora released his wrist and stepped back half a pace, the same calm, unreadable expression on her face that she wore every single day since she arrived. Her breathing had barely changed. There was no triumph in her posture, no satisfaction, nothing that suggested she had proven a point or wanted credit for what had just happened. If anything, she looked almost tired, the way someone looks after doing something they wish they had not needed to do. The whole exchange, from the moment his hand struck her cheek to the moment he was on the floor with his arm still caught in her grip, could not have lasted more than 10 seconds. 10 seconds. I remember counting it afterward, replaying it in my memory, certain I must have missed something, certain there must have been more to it than that. But there wasn't. 10 seconds had been enough to completely rearrange everything Draveth, and the rest of us, believed we understood about the girl sitting in the back corner of our classroom. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had experienced before in that room. It was not the silence of shock alone. It was the silence of an entire group of students trying, all at once, to recalculate something they had assumed was settled fact. Draveth pushed himself up slowly, his plated hand pressed against the floor, his breathing still uneven. When he finally looked up at Nora, his expression was not one of anger. It was something closer to confusion, the kind of confusion that comes from seeing the ground shift beneath your feet, without any warning. He opened his mouth as though to say something, some remark meant to salvage the moment, some old habit reaching for a way to reclaim the room's attention. But nothing came out. For the first time since I had known him, Draveth did not have anything to say. Nora looked down at him, and her voice, when it finally came, was quiet, almost gentle, though there was an edge beneath it that none of us had heard from her before. "I told you to stop," she said. "I meant it." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was so silent that her words reached every corner of it without effort. Somewhere near the door, Instructor Vell returned, arms full of training materials, and stopped mid-step at the sight of Draveth on the floor and the overturned desk beside him. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the scattered students, the stunned silence, the strange stillness surrounding Nora, who had already returned to her seat and picked her stylus back up, as though nothing at all had happened. "What?" Instructor Vell said slowly, setting down the materials with obvious care, "happened here?" No one answered immediately. I think, in that moment, none of us fully trusted our own account of what we had just witnessed. It was Nora who finally spoke, her tone calm, almost apologetic, though there was no real apology in her words. "He struck me," she said simply. "I stopped him from doing it again." Instructor Vell's eyes moved to Draveth, who was still sitting on the floor, cradling his wrist, his expression unlike anything any of us had seen on him before. He looked, for the first time in his life as far as I knew him, genuinely uncertain of himself. "Is this true?" Instructor Vell asked him directly. Draveth did not answer right away. When he finally did, his voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it. "I don't," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "I don't know what happened." And I remember thinking, as I watched him sit there on the floor, unable to explain the 10 seconds that had just rewritten everything he believed about himself and about the quiet girl he had decided to make an example of, that none of us in that room would ever think about Deathworlders the same way again. Instructor Vell called for the room to settle, though there was very little settling left to do. Most of us were already sitting rigidly at our desks, watching the scene in front of the classroom unfold, with the kind of attention usually reserved for lessons we actually cared about. He knelt beside Draveth and examined his wrist with quick, professional movements, checking the joint, testing the range of motion, watching Draveth's face for any sign of real damage. Draveth winced once, a small sound escaping him that he clearly wished had not, but nothing about his arm seemed broken or torn. It was strained, tender, the kind of injury that would ache for a day or two and then be forgotten by the body, if not by the mind. "Can you stand?" Instructor Vell asked. Draveth nodded, though it took him a moment longer than it should have to actually push himself upright. When he finally stood, he did not look at Nora. He did not look at any of us. He stared at the floor as though the answer to everything that had just happened might be written somewhere in the tile pattern. Instructor Vell turned to the rest of the class next, his gaze moving slowly across each of our faces, searching, I think, for any student steady enough to give him an honest account of what had happened before he arrived. "Someone tell me what I missed," he said. "All of it. Do not leave anything out." There was a long pause. I glanced at the students around me, all of us hesitant, all of us aware that whatever we said next would matter far more than it usually did. It was Priya Whitlock, sitting 2 seats to my left, who finally spoke. She had always been one of the more observant students in our class, someone who noticed things the rest of us missed, and her voice, though a little unsteady, carried clearly across the room. Dravith walked over to her desk, she said. He said things about her homeworld, about her species. He called her weak. He asked how many of her kind die before they grow up. Instructor Vell's expression did not change, though something behind his eyes hardened slightly. "And then?" he asked. "And then he hit her," Priya said. "Across the face. She didn't do anything to provoke it. She told him to stop talking about things he didn't understand, and he hit her anyway." Several other students nodded, confirming the account without needing to add much to it. I found myself nodding too, though I said nothing, still trying to organize my own memory of the last 10 seconds into something coherent enough to speak aloud. Instructor Vell turned back to Dravith. "Is any of that inaccurate?" he asked. Dravith was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice had none of its usual weight behind it. "No," he said, "that's what happened. And after you struck her," Instructor Vell continued, his tone even but unmistakably firm, "what happened next?" This was the question none of us wanted to be the one to answer, because none of us fully trusted our own memory of it. It had happened too fast, and too strangely, for any of us to feel confident describing it without sounding as though we were exaggerating. Finally, it was Ronan Ashworth, a quiet student who rarely spoke in class at all, who offered an answer. "She stopped him," Ronan said, before he could pull his hand back. "She caught his wrist, and then he was on the floor. I don't know how to explain it better than that. It happened so fast, I'm not sure I actually saw all of it." Instructor Vell looked toward Nora, who had remained seated at her desk this entire time, her posture calm, her attention focused on the small scuffed data slate in front of her rather than on the conversation happening around her. "Is that an accurate account?" he asked her directly. She looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Close enough," she said. "He struck me. I redirected the motion so he couldn't do it again. I didn't intend for him to fall as hard as he did. I misjudged the amount of force needed." There was something almost clinical in the way she said it, the way you might describe adjusting a piece of equipment rather than defending yourself against an attack from someone nearly twice your size. It was that clinical calm, more than anything else, that seemed to unsettle Instructor Vell. "Misjudged," he repeated slowly. "I'm still adjusting to the difference in gravity here," Nora said. "Things move differently than I'm used to. I apologize if it looked worse than it needed to." I remember looking around the room at that moment and seeing the same expression on almost every face. It was not fear exactly, though there was a thread of that woven through it. It was closer to the feeling you get when a piece of furniture you have walked past every day for years turns out to be something else entirely, something you never bothered to look at closely enough to notice. Instructor Vell was quiet for a long moment, clearly working through how to handle a situation that did not fit neatly into any disciplinary framework he had used before. Physical altercations between students were not unheard of at the Spire, but they typically followed a predictable shape. A larger student intimidated a smaller one. A confrontation escalated. Faculty intervened before real harm occurred. This did not fit that shape at all. Here, the student everyone had assumed was the most vulnerable in the room had ended the confrontation in less time than it took most students to stand up from their desks. "Dravith," Instructor Vell finally said, "you will report to the administrative office immediately. Striking another student is an offense, regardless of the circumstances, and this will be recorded formally." Dravith nodded, still not lifting his eyes from the floor, and gathered his things with none of his usual bravado. I watched him walk toward the door, and for the first time since I had known him, he seemed smaller than the room around him rather than larger. It was strange to see, the way it is strange to see a familiar landmark suddenly look unfamiliar from a different angle. Before he reached the door, he paused and looked back, just once, toward Nora. I do not know exactly what he was hoping to find in her expression. Anger, maybe, or satisfaction, something that would let him understand the moment as a normal conflict with a winner and a loser, something his mind could file away and move past. But her face held none of that. She was simply watching him with the same calm patience she showed every part of her day, without malice, without triumph, without anything that resembled the reaction he seemed to be searching for. He left without saying anything else. The rest of the class period passed in a strange, muted quiet. Instructor Vell resumed the lesson eventually, though I do not think a single student in that room retained much of what he said. My attention, like everyone else's, kept drifting back to the corner where Nora sat, working through her assignments with the same unremarkable focus she had shown every day since she arrived, as though the last 10 minutes had not happened at all. During a brief pause in the lesson, Priya leaned toward me and whispered, "Did you see how fast that was?" I nodded, because there was nothing else to say. I had seen it, and I still did not fully understand what I had seen. "They told us humans were fragile," she whispered. "They told us Earth was dangerous because of what happens to humans there, not because of what humans can do." I thought about that for the rest of the day, turning it over in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what has been living underneath it the whole time without your noticing. We had all been taught, from our earliest lessons about interspecies contact, that Earth was a place to be pitied, a harsh, unpredictable world that humans had barely managed to survive, populated by creatures who lived short, fragile lives compared to nearly every other species in the wider community. It had never once occurred to any of us to ask what kind of person survives a world like that. It had never occurred to us that surviving something dangerous for generation after generation might shape a person into something far more capable than we assumed, rather than something weaker. I found myself watching Nora for the rest of the class, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of careful attention I had never given her before. She did not seem to notice, or if she did not show it. She continued working through her assignments with the same quiet focus, occasionally glancing at the instructional display, occasionally jotting something down, entirely unremarkable in every visible way. But I could not stop thinking about those 10 seconds. I could not stop thinking about how completely they had rearranged everything I believed I understood about her species, about the quiet, careful stillness she carried with her every single day, stillness that I now understood was not emptiness at all. It was control. I did not see Dravith again until the following day, and when I did, I almost did not recognize him. I do not mean that in the way people sometimes exaggerate a story, claiming someone looked so different they were unrecognizable, when really they only looked tired or upset. I mean it more literally than that. Dravith walked into the shared dining hall the next morning, and for a moment I genuinely did not connect the figure standing near the entrance with the student I had known for the past 2 years. Part of it was physical. His shoulders, usually held wide and squared in a way that took up as much space as possible, were pulled inward. His stride, normally heavy and deliberate, the kind of walk designed to make people step aside, had become careful, almost hesitant, like someone unsure of the ground beneath their feet. He kept glancing toward the corners of the room, toward the exits, in a way I had never seen him do before. But it was more than posture. Something in his face had changed too, something harder to name. The confidence that used to sit there so naturally, the easy assumption that he was the strongest presence in any room he entered, had simply gone missing, and without it, his features seemed to belong to someone else entirely. I later learned, from Priya, who heard it from one of the administrative staff, that Dravith had gone to the reflection wall in the training annex early that morning, the tall, polished panel students used to check their form during combat drills. He had stood in front of it for nearly 10 minutes without moving, according to the staff member who noticed him there. When she asked if he was all right, he reportedly said something strange. He said he was trying to figure out who he was looking at. I think I understand now what he meant, though at the time it struck me as an odd thing to say. For as long as any of us had known him, Dravith's entire sense of himself had been built on a single idea, that he was strong, and that his strength meant something, that it placed him above the people around him in a way that could not be questioned. He tested new students not out of simple cruelty, but because proving his own strength against theirs was, in some deep way, how he confirmed his own identity to himself. And in 10 seconds, all of that had been taken apart by a girl from a planet he had been taught to view as weak, fragile, pitiable. If she had beaten him because she was simply stronger in the way another CoulSci might have been stronger, I think he could have absorbed it. Strength meeting greater strength is a story that makes sense, a story every student at the Spire understood instinctively. But that was not what happened. What happened was that everything he had been told about Deathworlders, everything the whole galaxy seemed to agree on about Earth and its fragile inhabitants, had turned out to be wrong in a way that left him with no framework at all for understanding what he had just experienced. His entire hierarchy of the world had assumed humans belonged somewhere near the bottom, an assumption so widely shared that no one had ever bothered questioning it out loud. When that assumption collapsed, it did not simply mean Draveth had lost a confrontation. It meant an entire structure he used to understand his place among other species had lost its foundation, and he had nothing solid left to stand on. He was called to a formal meeting with the school's disciplinary council later that morning, and I only know what happened there because Priya's cousin worked as an administrative assistant and overheard part of it through an open door. According to her, Draveth did not argue or make excuses the way he usually did when faced with consequences. He simply sat quietly and answered every question he was asked in a flat, subdued voice. When the council asked him to explain his reasoning for approaching Nora the way he had, he reportedly said he believed she would react the way every other new student had, that he had expected fear or tears or some kind of visible submission that would reaffirm the natural order he believed existed between himself and smaller, weaker species. When asked whether he still believed that order existed, he did not answer for a long time. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he finally said. The council placed him on a period of restricted standing, which meant he would lose certain privileges around the Spire and would be required to attend additional sessions focused on interspecies conduct. It was not a severe punishment by the standards of our school, but I do not think the formal consequences were what truly affected him. I think what affected him was far simpler and far harder to fix through any disciplinary process. He had built his entire identity around being the strongest person in every room. And in 10 seconds, in front of the entire class, that identity had been dismantled by the one student he was certain could not do it. I saw him a few more times over the following days, always from a distance, always looking smaller somehow, even though his physical size had not changed at all. He no longer approached new students in the hallway. He no longer made comments about anyone's homeworld during lessons. He mostly kept to himself, eating alone, sitting toward the back of rooms he used to dominate from the front. I want to be honest and say I did not feel much sympathy for him at first. He had spent 2 years making other students feel small so that he could feel large, and it was difficult to feel sorry for someone experiencing, for the first time, a version of the fear he had spent so long causing in others. But there was a moment, about a week after the incident, that changed how I thought about it slightly. I was leaving the dining hall when I saw Draveth standing near one of the long observation windows that looked out over the training courtyards below. He was alone, staring out at nothing in particular, his posture still smaller than I remembered it being before any of this happened. Nora walked past him on her way to the same window, apparently intending to sit near it with her data slate, the way she often did during free periods. I expected her to walk past without acknowledging him, or perhaps to give him a wide, careful distance, the way most students still did. Instead, she stopped beside him. "You've been quiet," she said, her tone neither warm nor cold, simply observational. Draveth glanced at her, clearly startled that she had spoken to him at all. "I don't know what to say to you," he admitted after a moment. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I'm not looking for an apology." "Then what are you looking for?" he asked, and there was something almost raw in the question, something that sounded less like the arrogant student I remembered, and more like someone genuinely lost. Nora considered the question for a moment before answering. "Nothing, really," she said. "I'm not angry at you. What happened because you didn't understand something, and now you do. That's all it needs to be." "But I don't understand it," Draveth said. "I don't understand how someone from a species everyone calls weak did that to me in 10 seconds. Nora was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the training courtyard below, where a group of younger students were practicing basic drills under the watchful eye of an instructor. "We're not weak," she finally said. "We're careful. There's a difference. My planet didn't teach us to be strong for the sake of being strong. It taught us to be strong because the alternative was not surviving long enough to have a choice about it. Every single person on Earth is descended from someone who made it through something that could have easily killed them. That doesn't disappear just because we leave the planet." She paused before continuing, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, losing some of its clinical edge. "You were taught that Earth was dangerous because of what happens to us there," she said. "No one ever taught you what that danger does to us in return. I think that's the part everyone keeps missing." Draveth did not respond right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said, for what I did." "I know," Nora said simply. She did not offer him forgiveness exactly, and she did not linger to comfort him further. She simply nodded once, turned, and continued on toward the window she had originally intended to sit near, leaving Draveth standing there alone with something that looked, for the first time since I had known him, like real understanding settling slowly into place. I did not know it then, but that quiet exchange near the observation window would end up being the beginning of something far larger than either of them realized, a shift that would eventually reach far beyond our classroom, far beyond even the spire itself. Word travels fast in a school built for thousands of students from dozens of worlds, and within a few days, the story of what happened in our classroom had spread far beyond anyone who had actually witnessed it. At first, the retellings were exaggerated in ways that made me want to correct them whenever I overheard a version circulating in the dining hall or along the training corridors. I heard one account claiming Nora had broken 3 of Draveth's limbs. I heard another claiming she had done it without even standing up from her chair. Neither of these things were true, but I understood, listening to them spread, why the story kept growing in the retelling. It was not really about Draveth anymore. It was about the idea that had cracked open in that classroom, an idea too large and too unsettling for a simple, accurate account to satisfy. For as long as any of us had studied at the Spire, the accepted wisdom about Earth had been simple and rarely questioned. It was a death world. Its gravity shifted unpredictably. Its weather could turn from mild to lethal within hours. Its ecosystems were, by galactic standards, chaotic and unforgiving, filled with predators and diseases that had shaped a short, difficult existence for the species unlucky enough to evolve there. Humans, by extension, were viewed the way you might view a survivor pulled from wreckage, worthy of sympathy, worthy of gentle treatment, certainly not worthy of caution. What none of us had considered, until that day, was what kind of person that wreckage actually produces. Within 2 weeks, I noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift in how students across the Spire behaved around Nora, and eventually, around the small handful of other human students scattered across different classes and years. It was not fear exactly, though there was an edge of that present in some interactions. It was something closer to a careful, deliberate respect, the kind you extend to something you have realized you previously misjudged. Students who once spoke about Deathworlders with casual pity began adjusting their language without seeming to notice they were doing it. I overheard a group of older students discussing an upcoming interspecies tournament, and where they once might have assumed a human competitor would be an easy, sympathetic underdog, they now debated in hushed, uncertain tones about whether any human students planned to participate at all. Instructors, too, seemed to reconsider certain long-held assumptions. I learned, through a friend who assisted in the administrative office, that the faculty had quietly requested updated information from Earth's diplomatic envoy regarding the physical capabilities of human students, information that apparently had never been formally gathered before because no one had thought it necessary. It seemed strange to me that an entire species could be studied and classified by an interstellar community for years without anyone bothering to ask what its survivors were actually capable of, but I understood, thinking back on my own assumptions before that day, exactly how it had happened. We had all been so certain of the story we were told that none of us had thought to question it. Nora herself did not seem particularly interested in the shift happening around her. She continued attending classes with the same quiet focus she had shown since her first day, sitting in her usual corner, completing her assignments without any visible awareness of the growing distance students kept from her desk, a distance built not from dislike, but from a kind of cautious uncertainty about how much space she actually needed. I found an opportunity to speak with her directly about 2 weeks after the incident, during a shared study period when the classroom had mostly emptied out except for the two of us. "Can I ask you something?" I said, approaching her desk carefully, unsure whether my curiosity would be welcome. She looked up, her expression neither warm nor unwelcoming, simply attentive. "Go ahead," she said. "Was it always like that?" I asked. "For your people, I mean. Is that why you didn't react the way we expected?" She considered the question for a moment before answering, setting down her stylus the same careful way she had before the confrontation with Draveth. "It's complicated," she said. "Earth wasn't always this difficult. There were long periods where things were relatively stable. But there were also long periods where they weren't, and those periods shaped us more than the stable ones did. You don't build caution and quick reaction into a species during the easy years. You build it during the years that almost end you." "But you didn't seem afraid of any of it," I said. "Not of Draveth. Not of anything since you arrived." "I was taught not to show fear unnecessarily," she said. "Showing it doesn't usually help, but that doesn't mean I don't feel it. I felt something that day, when he hit me. I just didn't let it control what I did next." I thought about that answer for a long time afterward. It struck me as different from everything I had assumed about her calm demeanor since her arrival. I had believed her stillness meant an absence of feeling, a kind of blankness that came from being too soft, too fragile, too overwhelmed by an environment far removed from the dangers of her homeworld. Instead, it seemed her stillness was something she had built deliberately, a discipline layered over feelings that were very much present underneath, simply managed rather than erased. "Do you think people will treat you differently now?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, glancing toward the window where the training courtyard stretched out below, still busy with younger students practicing their forms. "Probably," she said, "for a while at least. People usually swing too far in one direction before they settle somewhere reasonable. Right now everyone thinks humans are dangerous. Eventually they'll understand it's not that simple either. We're not dangerous for no reason. We're just not what everyone assumed we were." I did not fully understand what she meant at the time, though I think I understand it better now, looking back on everything that followed in the months after that day. Draveth, true to the quiet promise of that conversation near the observation window, changed in ways that surprised most of us who had known him only as the loudest, most dominant presence in our year. He stopped testing new students entirely. He completed his additional conduct sessions without complaint, and by the end of the term, I noticed him occasionally sitting near other students during meals rather than always at the head of his usual group, listening more than he spoke, something I had never seen him do before. I do not think he ever fully recovered his old sense of certainty about his place in the world, and in a strange way, I think that was the most important part of what happened that day. It was not that he learned humans were simply stronger than he expected, though that was certainly part of it. It was that he learned, in a very direct and personal way, that entire assumptions he had never questioned, assumptions the whole galaxy seemed to share without examination, could be completely wrong. I think about that lesson often, even now, long after that year ended. We are taught, All of us, from every world, a great many things about species we have never truly studied, assumptions passed down through guidebooks and casual conversation until they feel like settled fact rather than untested belief. Earth was labeled a death world, and from that single label, an entire galaxy built a story about fragility, about pity, about softness that needed protecting. No one bothered asking what kind of person a death world actually produces. No one considered that survival, real survival, generation after generation against odds that should have ended things many times over, does not create fragility at all. It creates exactly the opposite. It creates people who move calmly through rooms full of creatures twice their size, who absorb insults without needing to respond to them, who reserve their reactions for moments that actually require one, and who, when that moment finally comes, do not hesitate at all. The last time I saw Nora before the term ended, she was sitting in her usual corner of the classroom, working through an assignment with the same unremarkable focus she always carried, entirely unaware, or perhaps entirely unconcerned, with how much the room around her had changed since her first day. Dravith passed by her desk on his way out that afternoon, and instead of the tension that once followed him everywhere, there was only a quiet nod between them, an understanding neither of them needed to explain out loud. I do not know what will happen when more human students arrive at schools like ours in the coming years, whether the label of Death World will ever be reconsidered, or whether the galaxy will simply continue treating Earth's survivors with a new, uneasy caution instead of the old, careless pity. But I know what I saw in that classroom, and I know what those 10 seconds taught every single one of us, whether we wanted the lesson or not. We had been told humans were fragile because their world was dangerous. No one had ever considered what that danger might have built inside them instead.